So this leads us to Toby, and the 2020 sales trends report highlighted the emerging maintenance and repair economies, as well as the recycling and circular economies as viable business models. In the 2020 sales trends report, Toby, you wrote about creating resilient cities. So given your expertise in managing adversity and sustainability, can you tell us what resilient cities will look like and how businesses and sales teams can adapt and find opportunity in these markets?
Sure, thank you, Sue. I think what I'll just kind of think about what we know and thus what we do. And what we know right now is actually very little um, in terms of how the pandemic has been handled, let alone what it means looking ahead. We won't even know whether or not what we've done in Australia, which looks great right now, but we won't know for another 3 to 5 years whether it was the right thing to do when we see it play out globally. So I think one of the most overused phrases of this year is "this changes everything." And actually, again, in keeping with what I just said, we don't know what will be a long-term change and what is a temporary change. So if we look back when people used similar kinds of phrases and thinking coming out of the end of the First World War, so 100 years ago, in the midst of a pandemic, there was talk about the collapse of cities, telephone, obviously wire-based telephony, was really becoming mainstream, and people were talking about how now with the mass use of telephones, people would no longer have to inhabit cities. In 1920, New York was just over five, had a population of just over 5.5 million. By 1925, it was over 7.7 million. Sydney in 1920 was just over 800,000 people, was over 1 million people by 1925. London went through one of its fastest rates of growth during that same period. But what was different about London's growth was actually the central city declined from 4.5 to 4 million people. And while London as a whole grew, what you saw was a push into suburbs and people seeking a less dense living experience. And the reason I mention that, as I say, is we don't yet know. I think everything that Ben said and what he wrote in his article is extremely compelling, but we don't know how many people want to go back to the office. What we do know is that there has never been a point in history where people haven't wanted more choice. So I think that this will not be about people not going back to an office, but rather wanting to use it at times when they want. So if we build from that and begin to think about what does that actually mean for people on this call, sales, and so on. Another thing, and what this means, you asked me about sort of the sustainability and so on. In more recent history, but history nonetheless, I ran PricewaterhouseCoopers retail and consumer goods team in the UK. And spanning the global financial crisis, so beginning in 2008 into 2009, we surveyed 15,000 UK consumers about their buying habits, sustainable products, and so on. And almost 80% of people at that time, bearing in mind it's a different market to Australia and a different point in the history, but a lot of similarities, almost 80% of people wanted to buy sustainable products. Less than 10% of people were willing to spend a single cent extra at the payout. And I think also what one saw at that time was a flight to value. So what we saw was higher end brands, higher end retailers that had very loyal customer bases suddenly found that the Aldis and Aldi equivalents of this world were being used by much better off consumers. But we also saw people wanting to buy occasional luxury items. So, really sort of high-end designer brands for lipsticks, perfumes, and things that could really be a treat, but was still affordable, did very well. So again, what I think businesses need to do, as well as cities, is to really adopt what Nassim Taleb, the author of Black Swan and Anti-fragile refers to as a dumbbell strategy. Dumbbell, i.e., you're working independently of one another. And so what we need, I think, the strategy in a world in which we really know very little is we need accessible products and services that at a sort of a general point, and then we also need something that, while still somewhat accessible, can excite, the occasional excitement, as you call it. Now, as I sort of draw this to a close and give some space for Stephanie to talk, and obviously Stephanie has that property perspective, this does have huge implications for the kinds of place that we build. So if you're selling housing, do you fully assume that everyone is going to want a work from home space? And obviously the implications of that for design and cost? Or do you assume that actually they just need somewhere that occasionally may be used, and that might look more like a traditional model? We also, in that same vein, need to think about the urban development sort of model in terms of sprawl versus densification and so on. So rounding out, as I say, in rushing back to normal, because there will be a huge number of us who do want to kind of re-grasp the normal, we have to be careful that we don't rush back to things like over-dependence on car travel and some of the things that have kind of been baked into the way that we live. In the same, we need to pick up all of the kinds of suggestions Alison was making about energy use and procurement and so forth. And I think what is different now to that PwC-led survey that I mentioned of 10 plus years ago is, I think, consumers really are expecting sustainability to be built into the products in a way that was perhaps more optional or more unusual over a decade ago. And this does mean people will be paying more attention, as both Ben and Alison touched on, to where their goods are sourced, what goes into them. I think a more circular looking economy is clearly going to be part of that, and particularly Carl was talking about the infrastructure-led recovery. There is a huge role for government in mandating what is procured, how it is procured, and again, whether or not there is fully considered end-of-use materials and design structures into everything that is being built, and particularly that funded or sponsored by government. I'm going to stop there, and I'd love to hear what Stephanie adds in terms of that built environment piece. I think it's pretty fundamental.